Right, today on the MSR Political Corner, our special guest is the 5th District Congressional candidate, activist, former Minneapolis City Council member, Mr. Don Samuels. Samuels was cast into the national spotlight when he placed second to Representative Ilhan Omar in the 2022 primary in Minnesota. Mr. Samuels, welcome.
Thank you, Al. It's great to be here.
All right. Now let's open with this. It was a very close primary in 2022. The incumbent got past you by less than 2% margin. 57,683, 55,217. 50%, 50.3% to 48.2%. That's close.
Yeah.
How confident are you that you can overcome that razor thin margin this time around?
Well, last time around, Al, we started in late March for an August primary. We did a poll then that showed I had 28% name recognition. She had 98% name recognition. This time around, we started in November. When we did the same poll again in March, well, the first poll was actually in May. We did the same poll again in March. I had 75% name recognition, pretty much where I ended up at the August primary last time, and she has 100% name recognition. So as, what happens is, as my name recognition grew, people got to know who I was. Then my favorability grew, and so by August came around, I was within 2% of her, even though I was 25% less recognized than she was.
Okay.
So as my name recognition grows from 75% now to August, you will see the trend continue. Because
Okay.
right now in our March poll, we were neck and neck.
So being that it was such a close race,
Hmm.
so would you say this is basically a turnout? Whoever can turn out to vote wins, basically?
Yeah, well, to some degree, but
Okay.
it's more getting my name out there, people getting to know me.
Okay.
And the thing about it is that I'm a very different kind of candidate than Congresswoman Omar. I have a very different background, and people get to know what that means, that I'm real. I have deep connections to the community. And so those who don't know about me find out that I have an authentic public life. They get persuaded that I would be a better alternative.
Okay. And so you were with the council from 2003, I think, to 2014.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
All right, let's start from the angle of if you were to unseat her. Let's talk about that. Policy and legislative things. Let's talk about economic development. Um, what are your plans to stimulate economic growth and job creation in Minnesota's 5th Congressional District?
Yeah, well, of course, we know that small businesses is where the energy for the American marketplace is, innovation, and for stimulating employment. People employ people from their own communities, and the money gets uh, circulated. And so it's important for me to go to Congress and make sure that small businesses are being promoted and, in a way, protected until they get on their feet.
Okay.
And then, of course, making sure that that housing home ownership, so that people can build wealth, becomes also part of communities that are now shut out of home ownership, and so then they can become stabilized communities. Their children do well, and the economy does better.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Let's shift a little bit to healthcare. How do you intend to address healthcare accessibility and affordability for your constituents?
Well, clearly, President Obama did an incredible job bringing 50 million people from the margins of no insurance to having insurance. It's an incomplete job. It's imperfect, but I think that it can be tweaked and perfected, bring more and more people in from the margins until everybody has health care and universal health care is a reality. So I'm going to Congress to work hard on that.
Okay, good. All right, education. What initiatives do you propose to improve public education and support the teachers in the district?
Well, first, let me say that education is very, very important to me. It's how I got where I am. In fact, I started a program called the Peace Foundation when I just joined the city council back in 2003 to end violence in North Minneapolis.
Okay.
We had a lot of success, but around 2006, it became clear to me that 100% of the guys who committed homicides in that year were did not graduate from high school, and about
Wow.
85% of the victims didn't. So clearly, we needed to go upstream and solve this education problem.
Okay.
And that's when we changed this Peace Foundation to the Northside Achievement Zone, known as NAS today.
Okay.
And so the federal government played a big part in that, $28 million to the Northside Achievement Zone. So the federal government can identify bright lights of success, especially in low-income urban communities. Uh, what organizations, what programs are balancing outcomes for children that makes no difference what your zip code is. So I'm going to Congress to help to find those success bright lights and to make sure that we are outcomes focused, what's working, bring those things to scale for the good of community and for equity.
Oh, okay. Climate change. What steps will you take to address climate change and support environmental sustainability within the district? North Minneapolis has the highest rate of asthma for probably in the nation here
Mhm.
for among Black youth and so forth. So, what do we do that as far as environmental issues and climate change is concerned for that district?
Yeah, well, I guess you could call it urban environmentalism, but there are some things that are not directly related to climate change, but are directly related to environmental factors like lead poisoning. And when I was on the city council, we made a lot of moves to get funding. Some of that came from the federal government, some from the state, to make sure that uh, all the lead poisoning risks were reduced. But then there's also the reality that people live closer to freeways, closer to toxic facilities, etc. Those are also facilities related to health. And then, of course, you throw on top of that climate change, and the heat areas in cities and urban communities without trees, etc., makes it more toxic and difficult for low-income families. It's a lot of related things. It's very complicated and interrelated. And so I'm going to work on all those things with a deep understanding, and to make sure that urban communities like Minneapolis, especially North Minneapolis, and cities like Detroit and Gary and so on, that those communities begin to see their health improvements, and that other environmental factors are reduced, like lead poisoning and environmental challenges.
Got it. Thank you for that answer. This is the hot button for us: criminal justice reform.
Hmm.
Now, what are your plans to reform the criminal justice system to ensure fair treatment for all of our residents?
Well, first of all, I co-authored, along with Elizabeth Clinton, the Ban the Box in legislation in the city of Minneapolis. Was the first city in the state to do that, where you no longer have to check a box to indicate whether or not you have a felony. And so you can be considered objectively for employment. And that became state law, which I had advocated for at the state. And then ultimately, the state generalized it not just for its employees, but for all employers to ban the box. I also, as in my role as CEO of Microgrants after Philando was killed, having been pulled over for a broken light,
Yeah.
I started the Lights On program. And with the Lights On program, when you get pulled over by a cop for a light, instead of a confrontation, the cop brings you a voucher to fix your light for free, up to $250. And that program has been so successful, it's been brought to other urban communities by police departments and nonprofits. And now it's in close to 200 cities across the country and 24 states. And so and we've repaired 15,000 broken lights, and of course, much more than that actually were offered, and that leads to healed relationships.
Okay.
So I'm going to turn that into a national program, and I want to make sure that we begin to understand that the problems we have in law enforcement are driven by human value, human relationships. And when we begin to see each other as human beings, then we will treat each other fairly. And so I'm going to work on police abuse, making sure we find those components of policing that can be universally improved and turn those into legislation. And then also, we need enough police officers to keep us safe.
Okay.
You drive around the streets of Minneapolis, you see all kind of traffic laws being broken, people are being killed, young people shooting each other in Kias. Just a couple of days ago in North Minneapolis, after an accident and a shooting. That's all because law enforcement has been compromised in its numbers, and young people are taking much more risks.
Well, you actually slid two questions ahead of me because the next one is going to be public safety, but I want to go here first. Housing. How do you plan to tackle affordable housing and homelessness problems in the district?
Yeah, well, on the city council, I was very involved in housing, making sure that we had housing opportunities for low-income people, especially in North Minneapolis after the housing crisis. We got $110 million from the Obama administration to heal the housing crisis in the city of Minneapolis. And largely because of my advocacy, 100 of that $110 million came to North Minneapolis to fix up abandoned houses, foreclosed houses, and sell them to people of lower income, and to also repair houses so that our environment didn't deteriorate as many other cities like Detroit and so on did from their housing crisis. Our city did not experience that because of that kind of leadership. So I'm going to Washington to make sure that we continue to get involved in affordable housing at a higher rate, and that we absolutely reverse the Reagan era rejection of responsibility for homelessness and get people off the streets, out of tents, into decent housing, so that they can experience America as a first world country.
Okay, good. Public safety. What is your stance on police reform and community policing to ensure safety and trust? You kind of touched on it a little bit there.
Mm-hmm.
So you want more police officers on the streets?
Yes, more police officers in the street, police officers who are trained, managed, and disciplined in a way to guarantee good police conduct and the protection over punishment of our citizens.
And training across the spectrum, I think, because just in St. Paul, I think it was,
Mm-hmm.
there's a young lady who was just killed.
Mm-hmm.
I think she had a gun or something. She called the police and she had some mental problems,
Mm-hmm.
but they ended up killing her.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for those type of calls, would you be a proponent of having more mental health people go out with the police officers, or would that
Yeah,
be an
and
idea?
mental health is becoming more and more of a problem. I mean, it's going to double, triple, and quadruple until we get a hold of this whole social media issue and the mental health of our young people. And so we're going to have to begin to have mental health focus in and out of policing, but certainly in policing. And people, we need to have people who can be deployed as urgently as 911 call responses. They must be first responders
Hmm.
along with police, so that those tricky situations can be resolved humanely.
Okay, let's go to immigration. Do you support the government's current immigration policies on the southern border, and when it can in relations to like Haitians? I think they don't get as much access as other folks. And then waiver vouchers that I think they're visas that do not include one African nation. And I just looked that up on the State Department last night. I mean, for waiver vouchers to come into the United States, there's not one African nation on the list. even though we used to be partners with South Africa and so forth. And I mean, is that a problem you perceive with our government with nations of color? We have problems with the
Yeah,
Haitians.
yeah,
We won't
yeah,
invite. We won't let the Africans in,
yeah,
so forth on those waiver vouchers.
yeah.
We'll let every other nation just about into the country,
Mm-hmm.
but for some reason our State Department will not allow it.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, how would you feel about that as far as immigration is concerned?
Well, let me point out that I am an immigrant, even though I've been part of the African American community since I left college. Um, I am an immigrant, and so I know the benefits of being able to get access to the United States. But I also know the benefits that immigrants create for the economy, for the United States, and are some of the most enthusiastic participants in the machine of commerce, and especially first and second generation, where that energy to achieve and to work is very, very high, no matter what part of the world you come from. Unfortunately, immigrants basically replaced African Americans as the lowest members on the caste system, in the sense that they have no rights. African Americans used to not have any rights. Now, immigrants legally don't have any rights,
Mm.
especially undocumented. And so they become fodder for political maneuvering. And there's no price to be paid. You're not going to get less votes because there's no immigrant voting or undocumented or non-citizen immigrant voting block. There's so you can do anything you want. And so this crisis of the border was created less by the people coming in larger numbers and more by the nation using immigration as a political device rather than a problem to be solved.
Okay.
And so the accumulation of people at the border is because of the accumulation around the issue of immigration in Congress, the accumulation of dysfunction. And so, as the other part of it is that as immigrants become browner and browner, and Europe has less crisis, the huddled masses are less existing in Europe and are more in the browner parts of the world. White supremacists are concerned about this America changing too much.
Yeah.
Change is very hard for people, and when I was a young man, I never read a book with a black person character in it until I was about 20.
Right.
All right, so people are used to that America, and so to see that changing, books changing, movies changing, statues coming down, the president is black. All of those things are frightening to some people, and their immigrants then again become the ploy in all of this, the scapegoats. Because they're brown, we can't afford for America to get any browner, and so let's keep the borders up. Let's ban people from coming in. Let's keep the Muslims out, ignore African immigration, and keep America white. That is an agenda by a significant part of this country.
Okay. Let's go back a little bit here. We talked about mental health, veterans. How will you support veterans and their families that live in the district?
Yeah, well, veterans, I have some of my friends are veterans. And in fact, I was just endorsed by Tim Peterson, who himself is a veteran, who has a couple of leaky discs in his back and less cartilage in his joints because of his service. And we're very enthusiastic to recruit these young people. We invite them on the planes first to come sit. But the day-to-day challenge, especially of those still in the margins, continue to haunt us, and we are not careful enough for our young people who have made the greatest sacrifice. So I'm going to Washington to strengthen our support for veterans, the veteran health system, VA, and to make sure that homeless veterans are put at the front of the line, not just going on to planes, but having access to housing.
Got it. Thank you. Opioid crisis. What measures will you take to combat the opioid epidemic that's affecting our communities?
Yeah, well, this is crack gone wild. on all of America, right? I was just watching a Dave Chappelle fun thing, and he said when he came back to Washington D.C. as a 14-year-old to live with his mom, I believe it was, his parents were divorced. That he said 50 of his friends were selling crack. He said, and he said, I don't know who was smoking that much, but it was a crisis, and it devastated the African American community. That's why our jails are so full today. It was not seen as a mental health crisis or a health crisis. It was just a crime to be punished. And the policies that were put in place, which were heartless and inconsiderate of the humanity of that population, now are proven to be unsustainable when we have a whole nation involved in a drug problem. And so now is the time for us to understand the humanity of our past and to move into a humane relationship with our drug policies, to decriminalize them, and to make them a mental health crisis with facilities and mental health supports for our young people who are caught up in this crisis. And by the way, one of my fellow opponents to Congresswoman Omar was in med school when she had a nasty accident, got caught up in prescription drug problems because of her physical pain, then got into crime, was incarcerated, abused in jail, got out, sued against the county for the abuse she suffered in jail, took that money, went to law school, and is now a lawyer. And she said she reached out to my opponent 11 times to offer some advice on drug addiction and got not one answer. That's why she was running. But I'm going to be attentive, responsive on the issue of drugs, and have a relationship with the minority communities, the Somali and African American communities that are being ravaged, especially, and also the rural communities in our state, to make sure that we come together to fight this national pandemic.
I want to pivot back to criminal justice a little bit. We're looking at data that the prison system here has 60% of the prisoners in the state of Minnesota are African American or minority. 60%. And when we look at what are we, the ratio for the state, 12% most, maybe 13, 14%. But how does 60% of us end up in the prisons in the state of Minnesota? Does it sound like we're being targeted or criminalized, as you say, the African American community? Because it just seems like something's out of whack here. I mean, how do you put 60%? You fill your jails with 60% African Americans.
Yeah.
So only 12% of us in the state.
Yeah.
So, I mean, would you, as a congressman, would you take a look at that from a criminal justice perspective?
Yeah, from two perspectives. From the criminal justice perspective, making sure that laws are fair, that we treat drug problems as a health crisis rather than a law enforcement issue, and that we have laws and we have supports in prisons for young people coming out, so they have the supports they need not to recidivate. Okay. But then there is a upstream aspect to this. You know that one out of every six young people who failed to graduate from, it's a 6-to-1 ratio of those young people who do not graduate versus those who do graduate who go to jail. 6 times more likely to go to jail if you do not graduate from high school.
Tied to education.
Education is a big part of it, and so it's a case of neglect and abuse. You neglect early, then you have to abuse later. You neglect education early, or children, it's silent. You just don't hear about it. You don't make any effort, no dramatic efforts to increase graduation rates and performance. You just let it go. And then later on, you turn into a punishing machine. And that's where you put the dollars, that's where you put the focus, Then you have mentors, they're called wardens, and jail employees. Then you have surrogate dads. That's where you get them, in jail.
So
We have to do the work up front with our young people, and that's going to require some work from us too, as men, African American men especially, to turn into to a force of mentoring, a mentoring army of men to replace the dads who are not at home, and to demonstrate to your young men what real male leadership looks like.
okay. All right, let's move towards uh, governance and some representation. Like, uh, how will you stay in touch with your constituents to ensure that their voices are heard when you're in Washington?
Well, I live in North Minneapolis. I've lived there for 27 years. My wife and I made a pledge in college that I would always live in a challenged community, African American community. And so my wife and I have lived there for 27 years. Bullet came through our window within a week. It motivated us to get involved and to serve. So I came into office with my neighbors asking me to run unwillingly. I came into office having been involved with my neighbors, knocking on doors, inviting them to meetings in different languages, which I got people to translate, Hmong and Somali. And so that was my premise for service, public service. And so whenever there was a homicide, I would go to the corner that the homicide happened the next day. I'd stay there all day from morning till night to demonstrate that people need not be afraid of our streets, that we can transform that hateful place into a place of love and expression of support for the family and the neighbors. And so I've been 100% accessible. I'm more accessible in trauma and crisis than I am on a good day. And so I'm going to continue that in Congress. I'm going to continue to live in my community, not in Washington, D.C. I'll commute to Washington, D.C. I'll be seen at Cub Foods. I'll be seen in the parks. I'll be seen walking along the river. I'll be seen at community events. I will host town hall meetings on a regular basis. And my staff will have to be the highest performing staff in Congress for constituent service.
Okay. Now let's talk about bipartisanship. In the wake of the deep-seated partisan divide in Washington, how do you plan to work across the aisle to pass meaningful legislation?
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm running is that people feel there's an exhausted majority of people. They're tired of the drama, and they want a kind of leadership that can work across difference. And that's one thing I've discovered that worked at City Council, that when you bring your peers in who don't understand the North Side, you don't accuse them of racism. You don't yell at them. You just show them a picture of what's really happening, the disparity that exists in a graphic way. I used to have people at the vigils write notes to the mayor and the City Council. And after every vigil, I would translate those into emails and copy the originals and sent to them after every homicide. They got a packet, sometimes with 500 messages. And after a couple of years, the city council was transformed. So I know how to work with people to change their minds, to understand the humanity, that we're all one humanity. We're all one America. We're all one 5th District. And to have people who have resources begin to understand their responsibility to the rest of the community. And those people in Congress who are in well-heeled parts of town or who are white, to understand that we are all one humanity and we must serve and help each other. It's the only way to go forward. Doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Your number one issue is to make America work for everybody. So I'm going to work across the aisle, in the aisle, and to make sure that we get things done. I'm going to Washington to make a difference, not to make a point.
Okay. Just to flip back a little bit here, how will you support small businesses or entrepreneurs in this district?
Yeah, well, I think, we can have tax incentives for small businesses. We can give them breaks from some of the stronger requirements for businesses until they get on their feet or get to a certain size. And I was CEO of microgrants. I gave hundreds of grants to small businesses in this north side. Was the biggest area where those grants were given, up to $20,000. And and millions of dollars. So I know what, a small support can make a big difference for a fledgling commercial organization.
Okay.
And so I'm going to make sure that we have opportunities in tax incentives and financial incentives for small businesses.
All right. I'm going to close out with this question. It's a two-part question. It's what motivates you to run for the 5th Congressional District? Now, is it your perceived strengths or is it more about the incumbent's perceived vulnerabilities?
Well, let me say that there's a group of folks who met after the race prior to mine who are saying we need to replace this congressperson because of her perceived weaknesses. And then they said, who should we ask to do this? And they looked at all the names that they put on the paper, and they said, Don Samuels has the perceived strengths. So it's both. And so I'm focusing on bringing people together. That's my real strength. My perceived weaknesses of my opponent is that she picks a side on issues, very passionate, very justice oriented on that issue, but she misses the big picture. She misses the other side of the issue, which is a activist kind of orientation. They say activists never compromise. That's a requirement. But politicians have to compromise. That's a requirement. And so I'm going into Congress to work in the aisle, across the aisle, making sure that we have outcomes, not just issues, making sure that at the end of the day, we're delivering legislative progress, we're delivering progress towards justice, and we're delivering economic equity, and that we're addressing our ancient problems and making America a more perfect union.
Okay. Well, I thought that was the last one, but one more. What's your take on what's going on in Gaza?
Yeah, well, it's a very complicated situation. The President Carter, President Bush, President uh, Clinton, President Obama, and now President Biden have tried to fix this thing, to lead the fixing of it, and have failed. And so we have to be very careful with this because it's not simple. A soundbite won't fix it. This is going to take a ceasefire. It's going to take the return of the hostages. It's going to take America providing leadership for NATO and bringing the Arab countries together with Israel to repair the Palestinian Gaza Strip, to find, identify, and support democratic leadership that is responsive for a two-state solution, and so that we can have a sustainable peace.
Would you support no more weapons to Israel until it's resolved?
I think that would be appropriate now, and I don't think that would be an appropriate thing going forward. I think this administration is very troubling. Disrespected our president, our first black president, and and is now kind of ignoring his strongest partner, which is President Biden and the United States government, and how to deal with this issue. I understand they are very emotional about this. We were emotional about 9/11 and made some big mistakes. People make mistakes in war, especially when passion takes precedence over reason. But we can intrude in this situation and provide reason, and make some checks and balances for Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Okay, thank you so much. Listen, you have 2 minutes. You have the mic. It's yours. Talk about whatever you want to say.
Yeah, so I came to America in 1970 as an immigrant. I graduated from college with a degree in industrial design and became a toy designer, inventor, and ran design departments for 30 years. My wife and I continued my pledge to always live in a challenged community. I moved into North Minneapolis. I was a part of the Black church community, volunteering like a horse for 2.5 decades with children, and always living in the African American community, giving back, mentoring, thousands of hours of mentoring and tutoring. So I'm authentic in my compassion, and at the same time, I understand how to influence people with means, to talk comfortably with them. I was an executive in a Fortune 500 company, so I know how to span the gaps, to bring people together across economic, social differences for the benefit of those who need us most. And I know how to negotiate, to collaborate. So I'm going to Washington to make a difference because I believe in outcomes, not to make a point, because that's only gets you so far. They say if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. That's an African proverb, and it's wisdom that we can learn from today.
Okay.
So I want anyone to support me, go to donsamuels.com, donsamuels.com, click on Get Involved, help me to get to Washington to demonstrate what mature leadership looks like, help bring Congress together for the good of the United States and the world. Thank you.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, 5th District Congressional candidate Don Samuels. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Great to be here. And congratulations on 90 years,
Yes, sir.
Spokesman-Recorder.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.